receive a student ID when they're enrolled in high school or college. Other forms of ID, like a driver's license, they have a couple more extra steps that can become a burden to some young people.
Why is it rational to stop student IDs from being accepted at the polls to vote?
There's no standard for student ID. A student ID that's made by my kid's high school is going to be different than the student ID made by U of I. They're going to have different standards for what you have to submit to get them.
Okay, so we brought you that story 2 months ago, and Idaho Attorney General's office celebrated a win on their part. A district judge ruled youth voting advocate Babe Vote did not have a strong enough argument to take their case to trial. But the organization, well, they continued to say new state laws, 2 of them, by the way, 2 new state voting laws are oppressive and unconstitutional. So they decided to appeal that dismissal all the way to the state Supreme Court. Andrew Bartline continues to follow this story for us today like he did 2 months ago. So the question is, or you can tell us about this, Andrew, state justices heard arguments from both sides today.
Yeah, and it's the same rhetoric that Babe Vote and their allies, the League of Women Voters in Idaho, have really been on top of from the beginning. The law revolves around student IDs and voting polls, and then of course voting registration, that process in the first place. So the state of Idaho, or the Idaho State Legislature, I should say, passed both these laws last legislative session. The first is House Bill 124. That law bans student IDs as an improved ID to vote, while the second is House Bill 340. That law requires proof of residency for all forms of voting registration. Now, the state of Idaho says student IDs are not uniformly regulated, and whether there was a registration, and neither was the registration voting process, I should say. There was kind of a loophole there. So if you see like those clipboards when you go out to register to vote, in that registration process, you didn't have to have proof of residency to register to vote. The state tried to close that loophole. And for groups, including Babe Vote, they said they feel targeted by things like this. They say this law, in tandem with stopping student IDs to vote at the polls, well, they say students, older people who no longer drive, brand new residents to the state who have an out-of-state driver's license, targets them specifically.
How much can the legislature do? Can the legislature say, we don't like students. We think students voted too much in the last election. We saw the data that student registration spiked in Idaho more than any other state. So we, for no other reason than we don't like students, we don't like who they vote for, we're going to make it harder for students to vote. That's the question before this court. And we submit that that's not acceptable.
And I'm just wondering, where's the tripwire? Where do we say it's too far? In 1890, you didn't need a driver's license to vote. Of course, there weren't cars back then. Suddenly, you needed a driver's license to vote. Was that going too far? Are driver's license requirements unconstitutional under your argument because it creates a significant burden on people that don't drive?
The state argues in a broad sense, no one is losing their right to vote. The state is providing free IDs as part of this law to say that it is sufficient to cover the concerns of anyone impacted by law changes or these law changes. Now, the Supreme Court justices asked very detailed questions of both sides, Brian. The court will revisit this matter in about a month, and that official date is January 10th. So at that point, we might get a final decision on this, whether these are constitutional or not.
Well, and it's worth pointing out that people that use student IDs to vote in Idaho, it's a very small pool, correct?
It was like 140-something last presidential election. We interviewed the AG about it, and I think that's the number that came up when the state legislature, in their statement of purpose for these laws, it was like 100 or something.
Yeah, it's a very small pool, so it's affecting very little. But of course, as they argued, every vote is important. Thank you very much, Andrew.